now it's a great pleasure to introduce Prime Minister David Cameron. Prime Minister, we are highly appreciating that you join us here in Davos for the 7th consecutive year, first as opposition leader, now the 3rd time as Prime Minister. And of course, we are particularly honored to have your presence here today for 2 reasons. First, you made I would say, historical speech yesterday. And of course, we are very anxious to hear from you how you see Europe. But I welcome you also as the leader of the G8. The G8, which is under your chairmanship this year. You said, when you were here last time, and I'm not referring to your speech yesterday, you called for boldness, not caution last year, not only for what Britain does, but for the whole continent. You emphasized that Britain is part of the European Union, not by default, but by choice. And you set out last year a positive vision for the future of Europe. You followed up yesterday. But you also wanting Europe to succeed, not just as an economic force, but as a political force. And I think this follows very well the final words of Dr. Kissinger just a moment ago. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Klaus. It's great to be back at Davos, and thank you for that reception. As you said, it is the UK's privilege to host the G8 this year, and I want to set out today our main priorities. Now, right up there on our agenda is, of course, tackling the threat of extremism and terrorist violence that we've seen erupt in Mali and that despicable attack in Algeria. I'll put my cards on the table. I believe we are in the midst of a long struggle against murderous terrorists and a poisonous ideology that supports them. Just as we've successfully put pressure on al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, so al-Qaeda franchises have been growing for years in Yemen, in Somalia, and across parts of North Africa, places that have suffered hideously through hostage-taking, terrorism, and crime. Now, to defeat this menace, we've got to be tough, we've got to be intelligent, and we've got to be patient. And this is the argument I'll be making at the G8. Let me be, again, absolutely clear. There is a place for a tough security approach, including, at times, military action where necessary. The French are right to act in Mali, and I back that action, not just with words, but with logistical support too. But we need to combine a tough security response with an intelligent political response. We need to address that poisonous narrative that the terrorists feed on. We need to close down the ungoverned space in which they thrive. And yes, we need to deal with the grievances that they use to garner support. Now, this means using everything at our disposal: our diplomatic networks, our aid budgets, our political relations, our military and security cooperation, and yes, supporting in those countries and elsewhere the building blocks of democracy, like the rule of law and a free media. The Arab Spring remains part of the solution, not part of the problem. Now I want to open up a new debate too, in how we share the burden of meeting this threat. The G8 can help discuss how we can best divide up some of this work between us, and how we can each individually partner up with the countries worst affected to overcome this threat. And like I say, this is going to be right up on our agenda for the G8. But today, I want to focus on our economic priorities. Because for all the countries in the G8, and all the countries across the European Union, there is a big, looming, insistent question. And that is, how do we compete and succeed in the global economic race that we are engaged in today? How do we succeed when other nations are growing, changing, innovating so fast? Now, a lot of the answers are clear. You've got to deal with your debts. You've got to cut business taxes. You've got to tackle the bloat in welfare. And crucially, you've got to make sure your schools and your universities are truly world class. Now, back in the UK, we've been doing all of these things. Less than 3 years in, and this government has cut the deficit by a quarter. Our corporation tax rate is the lowest in the G7. In welfare reform, we've been radical. In education, almost revolutionary, busting open the state monopoly of education and allowing new, free schools to start up. And crucially, to compete in this global race, we are making sure that the United Kingdom is more outward-looking than ever before. Now, yesterday, as was said, I gave a speech setting out the UK's place in Europe. This is not about turning our backs on Europe, quite the opposite. This is about how we make the case for a more competitive, a more open, a more flexible Europe, and how we secure the UK's place within it. This is how I see it. Just over half of the EU countries are in the single currency, in the euro. When you have a single currency, you move inexorably towards a banking union, towards forms of fiscal union. And that has huge implications for countries like the UK, who are not in the euro and frankly are never likely to join. The club we belong to is changing. We can't ignore this. Change is underway. And the debate about what this means, it is live. It is happening right now. And as I said yesterday, consent in the United Kingdom for the steps that have already been taken is wafer thin. Now, some just say, well, let these events unfold naturally. I say no. We should try and shape them in the UK's national interest. Let us negotiate a new settlement for Europe that works for the UK, and let's get fresh consent for it. And it's not just right for the United Kingdom, it is necessary for Europe. Europe is being outcompeted, out-invested, out-innovated, and it is time we made the European Union an engine for growth, not a source of cost for business and complaint from our citizens. So I want the UK to look out, not in. And that is why, for the first time in a decade, UK foreign policy is on the advance. By 2015, we would have opened up 20 new diplomatic posts around the world, employed 300 extra staff in the fastest growing regions of the world. We are having to make cuts in the UK, but this is something we are not cutting, we're expanding. We're now one of only 3 European countries to be represented in every single country in ASEAN. And we have the largest diplomatic network in India of any developed nation. We are a global nation with global interests and a global reach. And if you think all of this is somehow an unashamed advert for the UK and UK business, you're absolutely right. Everything I do is about making sure we're not just competing in that global race, but we're succeeding in it. But my argument today, the argument I want to make in front of you, and the idea that the G8 will be driving forward this year, is that competing in the global race is not just about what we do at home. It is about the wider economy we'll operate in, the rules that shape it, the fairness and the openness that characterize it. We need more free trade. We need fairer tax systems. We need more transparency on how governments, and yes, companies, operate. Let me tell you why. It's the oldest observation of the modern age that we are all interconnected. Communication is faster than ever, finance is more mobile than ever, and yet the paradox of this open world is that in many ways it's still so closed and so secretive. It's a world where trade is still choked off by barriers and bureaucracy. It's a world where some companies navigate their way around legitimate tax systems and even low tax rates with an army of clever accountants. It's a world where, regrettably, corrupt government officials in some countries and some corporations run rings around the letter and the spirit of the law to rip off hard-working people and to plunder their natural resources. There is a long and tragic history of some African countries being stripped of their minerals behind a veil of secrecy. We can see the results. The government cronies get rich, some beyond their wildest dreams of avarice, while the people in those countries stay poor. So it is clear how devastating this can be for some developing countries. But frankly, all this matters and should matter to developed countries too. When trade isn't free, we all suffer. When some businesses aren't seen to pay their taxes, that is corrosive to the public trust. When shadowy companies don't play by the rules, that drives more box ticking, more regulation, more interference, and that makes life harder for other businesses to turn a profit. That is why I want this year's G8 to bring a new focus on these issues: trade, tax, transparency. Those are the issues we are going to be driving for this year. So first, we're going to push for more openness on trade. In late 2008, we saw the steepest fall in global trade ever and the deepest since the Great Depression. And more than 4 years on, trade has still not fully recovered. Now, this should be at the forefront of the mind of every leader, every diplomat, during those long negotiations on trade. And there's an enormous amount on the table today. You've got the US leading efforts on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In the European Union, we're about to embark on our biggest ever program of free trade agreement negotiations. We've got parameters for a deal with Singapore, negotiations with Canada, nearly complete, and we're about to launch negotiations with Japan. And of course, there's the beginning of negotiations on an EU-US trade deal. Now, the EU and the US together, we actually make up about a third of all global trade. A deal between us could add over £50 billion to the EU economy alone. Agreeing all the EU deals on the table could increase our GDP by 2% and create over 2 million jobs across the European Union. Trade between developing countries and within Africa is growing, and we should work to encourage that further. And we must also continue to support the multilateral system. This means working through the WTO to agree a deal to sweep away trade bureaucracy at the ministerial conference in Bali this December. That alone could be worth around $70 billion to the global economy and help trade to flow freely across the world. It is ambitious, but we must seize these opportunities to give a massive boost to free trade across the world. Now, the next T is tax. We want to use the G8 to drive a more serious debate on tax evasion and tax avoidance. This is an issue whose time has come. After years of abuse, people across the planet are rightly calling for more action. And most importantly, there is gathering political will to actually do something about it. Again, let me put my cards squarely on the table. Of course, there is a difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance. Evasion is illegal. It can and should be subject to the full force of the criminal law. But what about tax avoidance? Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with sensible tax planning. And there are some things that governments want people to do that reduce tax bills, such as investing in a pension, a startup business, or giving money to a charity. But there are some forms of avoidance that have become so aggressive that I think it is right to say these raise ethical issues, and it is time to call for more responsibility and for governments to act accordingly. In the UK, we've already committed hundreds of millions into this effort, but acting alone has its limits. Clamp down in one country, and the travelling caravan of lawyers, accountants, and financial gurus will just move on elsewhere. So we need to act together, including at the G8. If there are difficult questions about whether existing standards are tough enough to tackle avoidance, we need to ask them. If there are options for more multilateral deals on automatic information exchange to catch tax evaders, we need to explore them. And we want to work with developing countries on this too. The fact is, the poorer the nation, the more they need the tax revenues, but often the weaker the capacity they have to collect them. But we must not let them off the hook. It can be done. The UK has worked with the Ethiopian authorities to help with tax collection. And in the last decade, the amount of tax collected has increased by 7 times. All of this in developed and developing countries alike comes down to a simple issue of fairness. I believe in low taxes. That is why my government is cutting the top rate of income tax. We've cut corporation tax. I am a low tax conservative, but I'm not a companies should pay no tax conservative. Individuals and businesses must pay their fair share. And businesses who think they can carry on dodging that fair share, or that they can keep on selling to the UK and setting up ever more complex tax arrangements abroad to squeeze their tax bills right down, well, they need to wake up and smell the coffee, because the public who buy from them have had enough. And let's be clear, speaking out on these things is not anti-capitalism. It is not anti-business. If you want to keep tax rates low, you've got to keep taxes coming in. Put simply, no tax base, no low tax case. You need to have that base in order to deliver the low taxes that businesses and competitive economies need. This is the argument that's been made brilliantly by the economist Paul Collier, and I'm delighted that he's been advising my government ahead of this G8. This is about me and all the other G8 leaders being able to look our people in the eye and say that when they work hard and pay their fair share of taxes, we will make sure that others do so as well. Now, the third big push on our agenda is transparency, shining a light on company ownership, land ownership, and where money flows from and to. This is critical to developing countries. Of course, aid has played and will continue to play an important role in development. And I'm proud that the UK is keeping its aid promises. I'm also proud that we are leading the fight on global hunger, funding nutrition programs for 20 million children and pregnant women over the next few years. There should be, there will be, and I will back a major push on tackling global hunger, undernutrition and stunting this year. And I applaud the NGOs, the charities, the organisations that are motivating public opinion, business opinion, world opinion on this absolutely vital issue. But at the same time as talking about aid, we also need to move the debate on. So we're not just dealing with the symptoms of poverty, but we're tackling the causes. Now, I've argued for years that there is a golden thread of conditions that enable open economies and open societies to thrive. The rule of law, the absence of conflict and corruption, the presence of property rights and strong institutions. These things are vital for countries to move from poverty to wealth. And now, as the co-chair of the UN high-level panel, and with the presidency of the G8, there is a chance to put turbo boosters under this agenda. And I'm determined to seize that chance. I want this G8 to lead a big push for transparency across the developing world. And to illustrate why, let me give you one example. A few years back, a transparency initiative exposed a huge hole in Nigeria's finances. An $800 million discrepancy between what companies were paying and what the government was receiving for oil. A massive, massive gap. This is now, the discovery of this is leading to new regulation of Nigeria's oil sector, so the richness of the earth can actually help to enrich the people of that country. And the potential is staggering. Last year, Nigerian oil exports were worth almost $100 billion. That is more than the total net aid to the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. So put simply, unleashing the natural resources in these countries dwarfs anything aid can achieve. And transparency is absolutely critical to that end. So we're going to push for more transparency on who owns companies, on who's buying up land and for what purpose, on how governments spend their money, on how gas, oil and mining companies operate, and on who is hiding stolen assets and how we recover and return them. Like everything else in this G8, the ambitions are big, and I make no apology for that. 30 years ago, more than half of our planet lived on the equivalent of $1.25 a day or less. Today, it's not 1/2, it is 1/5. This is an amazing story of human progress, and it shows what is possible. We can be the generation that eradicates absolute poverty in our world. But we'll only achieve that if we break the vicious cycle and treat the causes of poverty and not just its symptoms. So let me end today by saying this. I know that some people might be thinking, he's talking about cracking down on tax avoidance, talking about making companies more transparent. Doesn't this sound like an anti-business, bash the rich, tax success agenda? Absolutely not. This is a resolutely pro-business agenda. I'm about the most pro-business leader you can find. I yield to no one in my enthusiasm for capitalism. It is an economic system that's generated more wealth, unleashed more human potential, and reduced more grinding poverty than any other in history. I don't believe that one person's wealth, fairly gained through free exchange and an open market, is somehow the cause of another person's poverty. I will have no truck with those who want to demonize the successful, to level down rather than to build up, or to those who continually seek to turn the word profit into a dirty word. But I also passionately believe that if you want open economies, low taxes, and free enterprise, then you need to lay down the rules of the game and you need to be prepared to enforce them. Poor business practice doesn't operate in a vacuum, it hurts the good. When one company doesn't pay the taxes they owe, then other companies end up paying more. When some cowboys play the system, all businesses suffer from the fallout to their reputation. That is why it's not just those in the NGOs who've been lobbying my government on these issues. It's those in the high rises of the City of London, bankers, lawyers, senior figures in finance. They've told us to pursue this agenda hard, and that is exactly what we're going to do. This is a vision of proper companies, proper taxes, proper rules, a vision of open societies, open economies, and open government. And we are going to work with our partners in the G8 to achieve it for the good of the people right across the world. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you. Happy to take some questions. I think there are roving microphones, so put your hand up and say who you are, and then ask a question. That's never happened. Barbara Stocking from Oxfam in the front row. Lady here, thank you very much.
First of all, Prime Minister, I mean, you all know, Barbara Stocking from Oxfam, Great Britain, you will know that the NGO community, and as you say, many concerned people were absolutely behind you on the things that you said on tax and transparency. So we are incredibly pleased to hear the way you put that out this morning. I'd like to push you just a little bit harder, because in some areas, transparency alone may not be enough. And the particular just example I would give is really the issue about land. The issues that are going on, particularly in Africa, about land grabs, where there is a real need for people also to actually adhere to some standards. There are voluntary guidelines, and clearly governments need to adopt those so that they have the sorts of regulation you're talking about. But equally, we need strong principles, for example, principles on responsible investment, that actually companies, investors also know how they should behave. And I'd quite like a little comment from you on that and whether that can go into the G8 agenda too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Look, Barbara, I think you make an important point. What I would say is, look, transparency isn't really an end in itself. It is a means to an end. Just being transparent about how much money a government gives, how much money a government receives, and all the rest of it, it is good of itself. It's open government, it's accountable. But the key to it is the action it leads to others taking. It's when you are transparent and you can see that money isn't getting to the right place, or the wrong people are doing this, or whatever, then governments can act. And we have to recognize there are certain things the G8 and the G20 and others can do, but then you do need to make sure that the capacity of developing nations is there to act on that information. So transparency is the means to an end, not an end in itself. But I take the point that responsible practice is, the case I'm making today, that is a very big part of the debate. I think, look, those of us who want to promote the free enterprise, free market system need to recognize, post the crash, post all the problems in the financial world, that we do need to have a debate about responsible capitalism and ethical business practice. We shouldn't be frightened of that. We shouldn't run away from that. We should walk towards it. And that's exactly what I propose the G8 should do this year. Gentleman here. Hold on, here's a microphone coming.
I'm the co-chairman of the Hinduja group. Prime Minister, firstly, I would like to compliment for the clarity of the vision what you have given, and we hope this is going to help the economy. Secondly, I understand you have a scheduled visit to India. India-UK has very good relationship. What would you like to achieve, and how is it going to help the economy of UK?
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to a visit to India. It was the first major visit I made as leader of the opposition when I became leader of the Conservative Party. It's the first major visit I made as Prime Minister, and I'm looking forward to returning. Look, I'm a passionate believer in open economies and in free trade, and I think that Britain and India have far further to go on trade and cooperation and investment. And I think it's in our interest for both of us to think, how can we lower the barriers? How can we make it easier to invest across our countries? One of the most impressive things I've seen this year is an old British, brilliant brand name, Jaguar Land Rover, with massive Indian investment, developing new models, vast R&D. It is a truly impressive sight to see the R&D that's going in and the new vehicles rolling off the production line. Now, some in Europe have thought in the past, we should discourage somehow foreign investment and foreign ownership of big, strategically important brands and businesses. I take completely the opposite view. I think that one of Britain's USPs in the world is to say we are one of the most open, most flexible economies. Come and invest, come and create the jobs. And actually, it's a calling card for Britain around the world. Between Britain and India, I think the opportunities are absolutely limitless. I want to see more cooperation in terms of universities. I want to see more defense cooperation. I think there's a lot more we can do in the healthcare sector. I think there's an enormous amount of energy cooperation that we can do as well. So I'm looking forward to the discussions we're going to have. I'm going to be taking a huge team of business and political and other leaders, and I hope we can genuinely build on what is becoming a really special relationship. Gentleman here. I'll get someone in the back.
John Chipman, Chief Executive of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Prime Minister, in the last 2 years, the countries of the European Union have strained every sinew and shown extraordinary flexibility to keep Greece in the EU. Following your speech yesterday, do you think and do you have confidence that the countries of the EU will equally show every flexibility and stretch every sinew to keep one of the top net contributors to the EU, the UK, in the EU?
Well, I'd just like to make the point we're in a slightly different situation. As you put at the end of your question, we are major net contributors to the European Union. But we don't just contribute our money. We contribute, I think, two of the best and most important developments in the EU in recent decades have been driven partly by the British. The single market, the biggest market on earth, tragically still not complete. It doesn't apply properly in digital, in services, or in energy. But the single market's been a British drive, and it's good for Britain and good for Europe and good for the world. The other thing we've driven is the enlargement of the European Union, bringing the countries, former communist countries of the East and countries from the South into the European Union. So I think we contribute a lot in terms of brains, ideas, as well as money, but we are a net contributor. Look, what I'm proposing is not just change for Britain, I'm proposing change for Europe. We have to be frank about our performance. We are falling behind in the world. We're over-regulating our businesses. We're adding too much to their costs. We're leaving our citizens behind. And that's what I said, that Europe too often has been a cause of cost to business and complaint to our citizens. We need to deal with that, not just for Britain's sake, but for everybody's sake in the European Union. Now, I'm very clear that it's obvious change is coming in Europe. It's happening already. And there will be further changes as the single currency inevitably means rule changes and treaty changes and other changes in Europe. As that happens, Britain's got a choice. You can either stand back and just hope it's all going to go away and the argument will settle down, or alternatively, my approach, walk towards it, say yes, the European Union needs to change to suit the euro, but it also needs to change in order to suit all of us as well. Make the arguments about a flexible, open, competitive Europe, take the British people with you, and then seek their consent in a referendum. That is what active leadership, rather than passively sitting back and see this argument and this problem slip away from you. Let's have someone right at the back. Lady there with the paper in her. No, right at the back.
Prime Minister, Amy Kellogg from Fox News. We've just seen President Obama inaugurated for a second term, and I know that our economies are very interconnected. You in Europe watch as we teeter on our fiscal cliff, and we watch what happens with the euro. So what I'm wondering is what you would hope to see him do, both in the economic arena to help Europe and the US, but also in the geopolitical arena, because as you mentioned at the top of your speech, we're dealing with a huge problem with international terrorism. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I wish him well. I thought it was a great inauguration speech, and it's an amazing event to watch and to witness. I think the first thing on my wish list on the economic front will be what I spoke about. An EU-US trade deal has the most immense potential to help grow our economies on both sides of the Atlantic. We're a third of world trade, and yet there are still many, many barriers when it comes to selling goods and services from European Union into the US or the other way around. And these are difficult issues. The reason the barriers are there is because special interests in agriculture or in business or elsewhere have wanted to protect them. So it's going to take a real effort. And I would urge businesses here, whether you operate in the EU, whether you operate in the US or both, get hold of your politicians and tell them how important this is. Because if we want growth in our world, this is one of the best ways to get it. Now, of course, I believe all countries over time have to deal with their fiscal deficits and their debts. We have to demonstrate that what we are doing is sustainable. Britain's had a huge challenge on that basis. When I became Prime Minister, we had one of the biggest budget deficits anywhere in the world at 11% of our GDP. We've got it down by a quarter. We've still got far more to do. It's incredibly tough and difficult work. All countries have to take that path. They can take them in different ways and in different paces and at different times. And obviously America has the advantage of being a reserve currency. But over time, we've all got to show that we're able to pay our way in the world. One more question I think we've got time for. Lady there at the back with the iPad in the air.
Stephanie Flanders, BBC.
All right. Good. Glad
you said that you're the best salesman for Britain. I do wonder whether you said you're the best salesman for doing business in Britain.
I didn't say the best salesman. I said I was selling Britain. There may well, okay. But I do my best.
As a salesman, I think a few people here might think you weren't doing such a good job in the sense that in the last 24 hours, you've told any business thinking about investing in the UK that we might not be in the European Union in 5 years' time. And this morning, you've told them that if they do come to the UK, they'll be put under enormous moral and public pressure to pay more tax.
I'll make two points to that. I'll make 2 points to that. First of all, there is a debate underway already about Britain's place in the European Union. Business know that. It is much better to be frank and open about that and set out the pathway where we're going to resolve this issue in a way that will actually benefit business, because we'll end up with a more competitive, more open European Union. And what I've been struck by the business reaction to what I said in my speech yesterday, is if you look at what the Director General of the CBI said, if you look at what the Institute of Directors say, if you look at what the Chambers of Commerce say, you look at what the Federation of Small Business say, if you look at the 55 very major business leaders who've written to the Times this morning they say this is a sensible approach. So yes, all courses of action on this issue have their difficulties, but I would argue the riskiest thing of all would be to do nothing. Would be to sit back, see all the changes taking place in Europe with the Eurozone, and just say this is nothing to do with us, and see all the debate in Britain and say I'm going to stand back from it. Much better is to get in there, shape the debate, lead the argument for how we get a more competitive, flexible, and open Europe, and then put that to the British people in a referendum. And business can see that the Conservative Party has a plan for how we deal with this issue. Now, on the issue, you're quite right to raise it, this issue about tax avoidance and some of the moral issues attached to it. Part of the reason for raising this at the G8 level is this is a problem for all countries, not just for Britain. But I think Britain has got a great offer to business, and let me have one more go at selling it, if you like. We are cutting our tax rates. We are going to be one of the most tax competitive countries anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the world. A corporation tax rate of just getting towards 20%. That is an incredible offer. If you invest in Britain, invent something in Britain, we have a patent box where your corporation tax rate will be 10%. Now, I think it's a perfectly fair argument to make, to say to businesses, to say to individuals, we will cut our tax rates. We will be competitive. We will not have tax rates that put off investment. But in return, we do ask that people pay their fair share. And what I was struck by at the Young Global Leaders meeting this morning that I addressed, before I'd even mentioned this subject, it was question number one. Someone who had invested in Britain for 18 years, who paid his taxes, and said that actually he wanted action to make sure that his taxes weren't staying high to make up for the fact that some businesses aren't paying their taxes. This is an agenda whose time has come. And if you're pro-enterprise, you're pro-business, you're pro the capitalist system, get out there and make the argument. That's what I'll do as Prime Minister. It's right for Britain, it's right for Europe, and frankly, it's right for the whole of the developed world. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. But one last question. Coming back to Henry Kissinger, who argued at the end, Europe has to strengthen its economic unity, certainly its competitiveness, but at the end, it has to become it has to aim at a political unity. What would be your reaction?
My response to that would be very clear and very frank. If you mean that Europe has to become a political union in that it should become more like a country called Europe, I don't agree. I think that countries in Europe have their histories, their traditions, their institutions, want their own sovereignty, their ability to make their own choices, and to try and shoehorn countries into a centralized political union would be a great mistake for Europe, and Britain wouldn't be part of it. But if you mean in Europe we should have greater political will to work together to get things done, yes, I'm all up for it. Not only am I all up for it, I actually help to deliver it. Europe has taken a big political decision to put oil sanctions on Iran. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because countries like Britain argued for it. Europe has got very, very tough sanctions against Syria. That happened not by accident because countries like Britain argued for it. So should we show political will? Yes, in working together. And I would argue, look what's happening on the other side of the world in Africa, where the French, in my view, bravely decided to go to the help of the Malian government and the Malian people in an emergency, which was the first country in Europe to step forward and not just say, we support you, but we're going to give you transport planes and other help to let you do what you need to do. Who showed European solidarity at that moment? Britain did, because we believe in cooperating, working with, and demonstrating political will with our friends and neighbours across the European Union. But I think we need to explain that political will is what matters, rather than the endless process of building new and more centralised political institutions that our people simply don't want to give their consent for. That is the challenge. I would say Britain is a major European player on all of the issues where Europe needs to act, being more competitive, fighting terrorism, combating climate change. We are right out there leading the arguments, making the arguments. And that is the sort of political action that we need. But a centralised political union, not for me, not for Britain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister.